You're listening to the 95Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 95 Podcast. My name is Carolee Culpepper, and I am here with our executive director, Dale Sellers. Dale, you've had kind of a big week, huh?
That's the understatement of the year. Yeah, we moved
a little bit busy.
Yeah, we moved. Well, I had prayed in December, and I'm going to turn 60 in a couple of weeks on June 3rd. And I had prayed, and I just said, Lord, I really would like to be out of debt. I want to be out of debt. We kind of consider 60 and on our fourth quarter, and I want to live debt free. And so if you can make that possible, I'd love to do it. And so just through a series of events, we sold our house. And we sold our house for almost double what we paid for it 9 years ago. And so as of today, it's the first time I've seen you since that happened. We are debt free. Don't know anybody anything but love.
Celebrate.
And, it hadn't even set in yet, you know?
Yeah.
And so, and we have a nice amount of money set aside to put toward, we're going to try to probably build a house next year. We may try to find a small farm and remodel it, but probably going to build a new house next year. And
Fantastic.
So,
what did you take Gina to the peddler to celebrate?
The celebration is not on our minds right now. We're old, and we moved. We're on a second floor apartment, and honestly, our teammate Marianne and her friend Michelle came and helped us, volunteered. If they hadn't come, we'd probably still be unloading that truck.
Well, Marianne is the volunteer queen, so
yes,
that
oh my goodness,
is right in line with her.
So you find out how much people love you when they help you move, because that's and see, the thing is, we got a storage facility 2 months ago. So all the outside stuff, the stuff that was in the garage stuff, all the stuff in storage has been there. So it's still a shock to the system. So anyway,
moving is hard.
I'm getting back in the groove of life, and what a great way to get back in the groove by having my friend Tony Morgan join us today for the podcast. Tony, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, and mainly because I haven't moved in the last couple of weeks, so I'm feeling pretty good right now.
Both of you, I can assure you, I'm feeling my age today. But anyway, we're gonna even that kind of backdrop it kind of leads into why I wanted Tony to come on. Tony's been on with us before, and obviously Tony has such a major influence in my life, and my daughter Tiffany, who works at Unstuck, but Tony I feel like he has his finger on the pulse of the church and what's happening. And I just wanted to kind of get on with you today, Tony, and just do a little deep dive into what you're feeling, what you're seeing, some different things. I don't use the term post-pandemic. I don't know if there is such a thing, but at least, there has been a shift now where things have gone back into a different direction, gone into another direction. And so today, here's what I want to entitle this, Carolee, so you understand. I want to call today's podcast, Do Something Even If It's Wrong.
Okay.
Because my dad, when I grew up, most folks know my dad was a house builder, and I grew up helping him. And there's this old Southern statement, or it might be not Southern, but the saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop. And somehow that evolved into my dad on the job site. He could not stand to see us young guys sitting around doing nothing. And so he would always say, do something, even if it's wrong. And that got on the inside of me. And so I would say that most of the major mistakes I've made in my life have happened because of that philosophy, because something, even if it's wrong, is not good. And so, I want us to talk about that in light of what we see churches doing right now. But before we dive into all that, Tony, take a few moments and just kind of, maybe there's some listener who doesn't know you or your story. Just give us a mention of a background, and then we'll kind of dive into some things we're going to ask you today.
I always assume every listener doesn't know my story, so that's actually an appropriate question. Yeah. So I've actually this summer, Dale, I'll be celebrating 25 years in full-time ministry.
Wow.
And of course, the first half of that journey, or a little bit more, was in local church context, and I served in a few great churches, and both up in Indiana and South Carolina and here in Georgia. But the last 13 years, we have been ministering to other churches through the Unstuck Group. And
has it been 13 years?
Yeah, it has been. So we are trying to provide as much resourcing, content, as much as we can,
Mhm.
free if we can too, to as many pastors as possible. But how we really engage with churches and help them get stuck is when we can get on the ground working with churches of all different shapes and sizes. And we've served now, I think it's over 550 churches.
Wow.
So that's been pretty fun, primarily here in the US and Canada. But we've also served some churches in other parts of the world too. So it's been a great journey. And Dale, I'm actually encouraged on this side of the pandemic, wherever we are. There's no doubt about it. I don't think churches are experiencing what they were experiencing back in 2018, 2019. But I actually have optimism on this side of the pandemic, which is saying a lot because I'm not naturally an optimistic person. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Yes.
Yes. What makes you so optimistic? Is there like one certain thing that you're seeing kind of across the board, or?
Yeah. So really the gist of that optimism is around the new people that are coming to churches today. And so there's no doubt about it. If you were just to look at the numbers and compare the numbers, attendance in many churches is down still from what they were experiencing pre-COVID. But what I'm hearing and then seeing in the data across the board is there are just a lot of new people showing up to church. And again, churches of all different shapes and sizes. So this isn't just a small church phenomenon. We're also seeing this in some of the largest churches that we work with right now. And just anecdotally, I can tell you, my volunteer ministry role in my church, I get to serve in the connections area, which is the place where new people commonly show up either before or after the service. And the stories I'm hearing, it's not just like, we don't like our old church, and so we're coming to this church. I haven't heard that story.
Yeah.
The stories that I'm hearing are, we've just been through a lot in the last couple of years, and kind of looking for someone to help me guide me through this journey. And we're looking for some answers because we have a lot of questions based on what we've experienced. And a lot of that is around, I would say, more mental, emotional health challenges that people are experiencing right now, which stands to reason based on what we've experienced as a society the last couple of years. A lot of relational challenges, whether that's with children in the parenting realm, or marriages, or just singles too, just trying to figure out how do we navigate in this new normal. So there's just a lot that I think people are carrying generally. And what's encouraging to me is, believe it or not, they're actually showing up to church on Sunday morning because it's their sense there's maybe a spiritual component to some of what they're experiencing in their lives, and they're seeking direction, and they're seeking answers, and actually coming to the church for that. And I think there's always been this kind of underlying assumption that for churches to be healthy, thriving, to have impact, we need to be equipping the saints to go out, to engage people, to help them meet Jesus, and then come to church. And yeah, I hope that's happening. I think that's part of the mission that God's called us to. But the other dynamic that's in play here is people are still kind of in that come and see mode. Because of the challenges that they're feeling in their lives, they're actually looking for answers. They're looking for help. And I think it's a good thing that they're actually showing up to the doorstep of a church, may not even have been invited by anybody, but they think that's part of the next step they need to be taking in their lives.
So are you seeing the pastors of the churches prepared for this?
No.
That's why I want to have you on today. Neither are we. And again, our focus is mostly the small and mid-sized church. Unstuck works with all type churches, but both of us are kind of have a national impact or influence. And I just want to hear what you have to say, because I know what I'm seeing.
Yeah. There's no doubt there are some churches that for years, even before the pandemic, were really intentional about expecting new people to show up on Sunday morning. And because of that, basic things, just language that they use on Sunday morning during the services, having appropriate guest services to welcome people to the church, making sure that there are healthy, engaging environments for the entire family. So not just the adults coming to the services, but also for their kids primarily. And before the pandemic, of course, there were churches that prioritized that. That was just part of their intentional ministry strategy to connect with new people and then encourage them to take next steps towards Jesus. But I would say one of the dynamics that we're seeing on this side is that a lot of churches that we're engaging with, and this is a part of our process, it's just kind of built into our Unstuck process. We actually go on site and experience firsthand Sunday mornings at the churches that we're serving. And many times what we're seeing is churches are kind of just doing church the way they've always done church. And they're expecting the people that are connected to their congregation to be there on Sunday morning, but they're at least acting like they're not expecting any guests to be there. And it's always been a conviction for me, Dale, because as I read scripture, there's this intentionality that I see, especially in the New Testament church, not only for equipping the saints, but also for being sensitive to the people in our lives that aren't yet following Jesus. And I mean, the most convicting passage of scripture for me on this is in 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul, he's talking to the church about speaking in tongues. But you got to read through that full passage, because as Paul is describing the dynamic of what's happening in our gatherings, he's talking about the gatherings of the body of Christ, of the church. He's saying we have to be super sensitive to the fact that there will be unbelievers in our gatherings. And I'm just thinking, Paul knew, a couple thousand years ago, this would be an issue for the church today, because I think many times as we're planning our worship experiences, as we're planning our teaching, as we're planning how we engage Sunday mornings, we are so hyper-focused on the believers, the people that are a part of our congregation, that we're neglecting what Paul challenged us to consider, that we should be expecting unbelievers. Basically, we should be expecting guests to be with us as well. And honestly, I don't think churches are as prepared as they need to be in this specific season when we have so many new people coming to our churches.
How do you strike the balance between, caring for the believers in the church and equipping them, and also welcoming the visitors? Because there's probably also, a lot of difference between like an unbeliever who's never heard the gospel and someone who's been to church for 25 years who's really looking for something more in depth.
That's true. However, I will say this, the challenges that we're seeing in society now are not just a reflection of people that don't have faith in Jesus, not pursuing truth in their lives, and not being shaped in how they're living their lives because they're following Jesus. Honestly, some of the biggest challenges that we're facing in our lives, in our culture today, are also a reflection of people who claim to follow Jesus, who are not living out who Jesus called us to be. And so I actually think, I think it's a false dichotomy to think that our teaching on Sunday morning can only be for believers, or it can only be for people that are seeking and considering the claims of Christ. I think that's just a false dichotomy. And it's a carryover from the 90s, maybe early 2000s, where there were some high profile churches that kind of went all in on what was called a seeker sensitive model back then. And thankfully, the vestiges of that are still there. But thankfully, I think most churches have recognized it's a false dichotomy. Even the believers in our congregations, they need, I would argue, maybe more help trying to follow the basics of Jesus' teaching about the things that are essential to who it is to be a Christ follower in the context of the world we live in today. And I would argue truth is truth, and believers need to hear the truth. Unbelievers need to hear the truth. And all of us, because we're in a different place in our spiritual journeys, we're all going to receive that. And then because of that, I think we all have different next steps that we need to be considering.
Okay.
But the reality is Jesus taught on all the principles that the world needs to hear today. And we just need to point people back to Jesus. We point people back to scripture, but help them figure out how do we take this truth and apply it to our daily lives. And I'm just telling you, yes, unbelievers need help with application of truth in their lives, but believers need it just as much.
Well, you set the stage very well for where I wanted to go today. So it sounds to me like your optimism is based on the fact that people are looking for answers. They are looking for truth. But as we've already kind of highlighted, a lot of pastors, a lot of church leaders weren't equipped, if you will, you don't go to seminary and learn how to work through a pandemic. And so what I discovered is that most folks, when you don't know what to do, you just go back to your default. And so, when you talk to leaders, as Unstuck works with leaders, as you work with leaders, do you see folks who are just kind of taking my dad's philosophy of just do something, even if it's wrong?
Not as much as I would hope. It's funny, Dale, I just had this conversation just this past week with a church, and it was over something relatively simple, service times on Sunday morning. And I'm always amazed at how this is like the gospel, our worship style, and the time that we start services on Sunday morning. It's like the trifecta. It's like the Holy Trinity of things that you just don't touch as churches. And it's always boggled my mind. But where I'm engaging with the pastor and his team, and we're talking about this, and he said, you know what? We just need to tell. And the reason why they were considering adjusting the times is they're at a place where, because of facility constraints at a couple of their locations, they need to adjust the time so that they can, and add some time so they can accommodate more people on Sunday morning. I mean, this is a great problem to have, especially on this side of the pandemic. And the senior pastors said, finally, you know what? We just need to tell people this is not a decision. We just need to try something to see if we can accommodate more people. And he said, my suspicion is if we don't tell people this is a decision that we've made, but it's just something we're going to try, they're going to be more open to the trial and knowing that it's not a full commitment, that this will always be the case. And his suspicion, and I think he's accurate, is if he goes into it as this is just something we're going to try, we don't know if it's going to work or not, but it's something we're going to try. He said, my suspicion is it's going to work. It's going to allow us to accommodate more people. And before we know it, that it was only a 15-minute adjustment, by the way, that they were considering. That 15-minute adjustment that we're considering as far as starting our services, people are going to forget about it because that'll become the new normal.
Sure.
But I think it's a perfect example of, Dale, how we many times in the context of church get married to our methods. We get married to the way that we do church. And you've heard me say this many, many times, Dale, but the primary reason that we see churches getting stuck is the way they do church becomes more important than why they do church. Now, that's, by the way, maybe some bad theology there. I don't believe that we do church. That I believe we need to be the church.
Yes.
But the phrase, I think people can engage that. They get it. When the way becomes more important than the why, that's when we find challenge. And this is where I think it was your dad's principle.
Yeah, it was my dad.
Just do something.
Just do something.
I think there's something to that. I think every church should be considering some bold moves where it's like, we don't know what the outcome's going to be. We have a good sense. This is what God's calling us to do next. And when you take a step like that in faith, a couple things happen. Number one, we have to lean more on God. We need to make sure as leaders, we're prayed up to make sure he's actually leading us through whatever this change is that we're considering. But secondly, it forces us to get a little bit uncomfortable and to really make sure we're being more intentional about the pivots that we're considering. And that's a good thing as well. I think one of the challenges that I face in my life, maybe I'm the only one that deals with this, is I get to a very dangerous spot, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, when I get too comfortable in my life. And the reason why is this. I think it comes back to a pride issue, Dale. I think when I'm comfortable and I'm not being challenged in any way, including considering new next steps that we need to be taking, I think it's pride, because in my comfort, I feel like I got this. I've done this before. I know how to do this. And I actually think taking that risk, and it may be a calculated risk, but taking that next step, trying something new, it actually forces me to step outside my comfort zone, to lean more on God, to lean more on the Holy Spirit, and really to lean more on the people that God has around me too, because I recognize I can't do this in my own effort. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in your father's advice there, Dale, and we need churches, especially in this season, to be taking a step. It's no different, is it, than the Old Testament stories that we read about God's chosen people crossing into the promised land. And the story of Joshua in particular, where he's basically praying, he's talking to God about the barrier between where they are and the ability to cross into the promised land. And of course, it's a raging river. And God's just saying, you need to tell the priest, take a step into the water. And if I'm Joshua, I'm thinking, say what? I'm going to ask them to take a step, and then God doesn't say what's going to happen next. There's actually no indication if you read that passage of what's going to happen next. But as we know the story, the priest step in the water's part. The people of God cross on dry land. They experience the promised land. And that passage I think is a great picture of what the principle we're talking about here is we need to hear from God. What is that next step we need to take? We may not know what God's promising on the other side of that next step, but we need to be willing to take that next step in faith. And right now, this is a season where churches need to be considering the next step that God has for your ministry, rather than just staying outside the promised land. We need to be willing to take that next step.
I've been telling churches, listen, all you have to do is just try something and then blame the pandemic. And I tell them, listen, you can blame the pandemic for the next 10 years, 10 years from now, you make it, well, because of the pandemic, you just blame everything on the pandemic.
That's absolutely right, Dale. That is absolutely right.
Well, I heard you say something about, making a calculated decision and a calculated move. And I think, Dale, kind of what you were saying at the beginning was more like, just do whatever and hope for the best. But Tony, I'm hearing you say more like,
Tony's kind of turned this from where I was originally going, and I like where he's going.
Surrounding something in prayer, being intentional. When
you say do something that's wrong, obviously you don't want to do something that's sinful or you just but that's not what he's talking about, And so here's the next question then. So here's a church that they are completely stuck, and they're at a place now to where they really need to relaunch. And in fact, if you would kind of go into how does the church know when it's time to relaunch versus just keep pressing down that same road? What would you say to that?
Yeah. So I think the indication that you may need to relaunch really has to do with the fruit that you're experiencing in your ministry. And, here I liken this to considering the parable of the talents, where you have these three folks that, I mean, God, or the master in the story, of course, is giving them a different allocation of money, essentially. And the two that actually have the most money are investing it. I mean, and because of that, they're getting a good return for that investment. It's interesting that the person that has the least money in that parable buries it, and then as a result of that, there's no additional return. And I've used this as a parallel, especially for churches in this season, because I think the natural tendency, Dale, is to kind of gravitate back to the way that we've done church, especially as we come out of the pandemic and it feels more normal in our culture. I think that most churches now are, because of that, going back to what they knew to be normal as far as their approach to church and ministry strategy. And the challenge, of course, is even on this side of the pandemic, and we saw this before COVID, many churches just weren't winning when it came to a return on the ministry investment, if you will, that they were making. And so I think the challenge here is we need to look at ourselves as stewards of a mission that God's called us to as churches. And if as stewards of that mission, we're not getting the return, in our case, if we're not seeing life change, if we're not seeing people giving their lives to Jesus and then taking steps towards Christ and getting on mission with Jesus, if that's not happening, and we still are kind of going back to where we were pre-pandemic with the same people, in most cases with less people, and we're not seeing new life change happening, I think that's an indication that something needs to change, and a relaunch should be considered. How can we get back to a place where we're experiencing health again as a ministry, and we're seeing new people come to Christ and seeing new people get on mission with Jesus? And so then the question is, how do we do that? How do we relaunch? And my concern here is what we've seen churches do is, again, they just jump to the methods. So they just assume, well, because the way we were doing church wasn't working, let's just pick a new way of doing church. The problem is with that, as soon as you start to talk about changes in methodology, that's when you start to divide churches. And so jumping to your methods, jumping to your ministry strategies is not your first step. If you're going to relaunch so that your church can have health again, I would encourage you really to go back to square one and start to ask the foundational questions like, why do we exist as a church? What has God really called us to do? Who are we trying to reach? Where has God placed our church? Who's in our mission field? So who are we really trying to engage with the gospel message? Once we do connect with them, how do we help them take their next steps toward Christ? And then with that, you'll start to build out kind of a strategy, an approach that will lead to the method changes, the strategy changes that need to occur. But it's all going back to the why questions first. Why are we doing what we do? Why are we gathering as a body of Christ? Why are we on mission? And when you can start at that place and help your leaders, help your congregation get agreement on that, the likelihood then that you're going to bring more people with you and any changes in strategies and methods increases. Now, I will say this, Dale, for the church that needs to relaunch, this is just as leaders in the church, whether you're a pastor or you're a lay person that's leading, you need to know this. Even if you come to a healthy agreement on what God's called you to do as a church, and as a result of that, you agree together, these are some strategy changes. These are some method changes that we need to make. And you move forward with that. It's definitely what God wants you to do to engage the mission he's called you to. You will hopefully bring a lot of people from your existing congregation with you in that, but it's a guarantee you will also lose some people in that. And the reason why is There are just some people, it doesn't matter if it's good change or bad change. They just don't like change. And even if the change is to fulfill the mission God's called our churches to, because they don't like change, they won't like it and they will leave. And this is, I just have to tell you, every healthy church that we've ever worked with has recognized this. It's that they're trying to bring as many people along as they can, but they know they will never be able to reach new people to actually fulfill the mission God's called their church to in their community if they never change. And because of that, they know they're going to lose some people along the way. But in the end, they're going to have a far greater kingdom impact, and they're going to see far more life change happening if they work through that process to relaunch, as you just described.
That's great.
I'm just want that to settle in, because one, I'm sitting here as you're talking, just going, listen to this guy's passion. I mean, Tony he lives this, he loves this, he understands it. But we also have to tell you the truth, and the truth is you can't keep everybody. You're not going to take everybody with you. And so I wanted to use that to segue into, I know one issue that's not divisive at all is what do we do with online ministry moving forward? So now, we only have an hour for this podcast. So but can you just, can you give me some examples of churches maybe you've seen that are doing online well or hybrid well?
Yeah. Well, let me just share this, Dale. I know your audience is primarily pastors in smaller churches, and because of that, maybe I don't know what advice you've been giving smaller churches around online, but I hope to give them maybe a little bit of a reprieve, because I don't think you need to put all of your ministry online for this next season. Absolutely, I don't think that's necessary. In fact, I would encourage you, as you're thinking about your online strategy, to back up and to actually start at what it's going to involve some work, but it's a step that every church of every size can make. And it actually is free. And here's what I'm going to suggest. Especially for small churches, let's face it, the advantage you have over larger churches is the relational component that you offer, because in smaller churches, people know people. And because of that, there's a connection that happens that you can offer that larger churches just can't offer. And related to online ministry, what I want to challenge you to do is play off that strength that you have that other larger churches don't have. And it's related to how you leverage social media. And I will say this is, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that I see churches making related to their online strategy. And it's this: they're using social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, on down the line, to promote what's happening at the church, rather than engaging people relationally online and just building relationship with people using social media, which is, it's what social media was really designed to do in the first place. But we look at Facebook, we look at Twitter, we look at Instagram more as promotion platforms for what's happening at the church, rather than leveraging those tools to actually engage with people, to hear their story, to hear their prayer requests, to hear the challenges they're facing in their lives, and to engage with them more in a back and forth conversation. And I think this is something that any church could do.
Absolutely.
Now,
we had a girl.
I would argue. Yeah, go ahead.
We had a young woman on the podcast not long ago that was saying, like, if you could do something as simple as like putting out on Instagram and Facebook, like, how can we pray for you this week? And then follow up with people, just like real engagement and answering questions or needs that people have, instead of being like, hey, look at us. Cause nobody really,
we're
that much.
We're all numb to the promotions. I mean, we're just
right. I mean, if I see something like that, I'm going to scroll on past. But if it's something that's answering a question that I have, or a need that I have, or if it's somebody reaching out, like, I mean, I'm definitely more willing to, or apt to stop and look.
That's right.
That's right. But you're right. That's all relational. It's just on a social media platform rather than face to face.
That's right. That's right. And then I think when normally when I hear that question, I think what pastors are thinking about is how do we get our services online or don't get our services online?
Yeah.
And, for smaller churches, I'm not convinced that that's a necessary requirement.
It's not.
If it helps you engage with people and helps them get a taste of what's happening in your church before they come visit your church, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, if you can't show your service online in a way that's captivating to people so that they are interested in possibly coming and visiting your church in person, I wouldn't put it online because it actually may be a deterrent to people rather than an encouragement to people.
Sir.
So that again, Dale, I mean, if I were talking to a different audience, my advice might be a little bit different, but my goodness, it just seems like there are advantages that smaller churches have that you should play to your strength rather than trying to be something really that you don't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
One of our staff guys who actually lives in Atlanta, Jesse Barnett, he's doing a thing called digital discipleship coaching. And the tag to that is getting more mileage out of your message. So we're taking the pastor's message he's already preached and teaching them how to cut it in just a few bite-sized things to put out there to engage. What we're trying to get folks to do is engage with and honestly, when it comes to putting your service online, one thing I've been begging churches to do: stop putting your music out there. Because, when we're in the room, obviously it's anointed, it's wonderful, it's blessed. But unless you have millions of dollars to invest in equipment like The Voice and American Idol does, please don't do that because it doesn't sound good. And the point of that is, I'm not being critical. And I know when I talk about this, it's all the soundmen go, yes, yes. And all the pastors are like, what? Because it's their little, their thing. But here's the deal. It will turn people off. They won't even watch the message if it's not good quality. So,
well, and let me just double down on that advice. I think that's perfect advice, Dale. But you're talking to small church pastors. I was actually just talking to a pastor of a church of tens of thousands of people, and he said we don't. When we put our services online, we just include the message, and then at the very end, we may include some music. He said, but what they learned is even the music that they're putting online, people aren't watching, because if people are looking for music online, they're going straight to Bethel or Hillsong or Elevation, or they're not looking for the music that you're even this big church, and they have all kinds of resource and all kinds of talented people. There's a lot of wisdom in that advice.
Well, I even seen some big churches, and I have no idea who you're talking about, but I just know some that who do have lots of great equipment, and it still doesn't sound good. And what I mean by that is it just doesn't translate on a computer or on a television the way it does in the room. And so we can't just throw it out there and go, that's good enough, because it's not. That's part of the point of today is you got to be strategic in what you're doing. So that's kind of the advice we've been given for sure.
For sure. Going back to kind of the relaunching topic, or even just getting back to the basics, any church, whether they're relaunching or not, if they're just kind of going back to the whys. Say you had a church who has gone back to those, kind of basic questions. This is why we're doing this. This is what God's called us to do. What are maybe like one or two things that they could do immediately that would create some positive momentum with the congregation, and even just with, the ministry team itself?
Yeah. I just think I can't state how important it is to really consider where God's placed your church and who you're trying to reach. And this probably sounds so obvious, but I just think it's so easy for us just to continue doing church the way we've always done church and just assume, well, that's what we're supposed to do. But in that, I think we lose sight of the fact that, no, actually, God has placed our ministry in a community. It's our mission field. And just like the missionary in Kenya or Burkina Faso or wherever, we are called to this particular mission field. And I think it's been amazing to me as I've helped churches really get clarity on who it is they're trying to reach. It's just opened their eyes to how they could be approaching everything they do with a new filter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simple stuff. Like the pastor gets locked in, realizes, oh, this is who I'm trying to reach.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, there's just some nuances in how they teach that begin to shift. And the great thing is, for most pastors, you don't have to get your board to approve that shift. You don't have to take a congregational vote to make sure that you're allowed to make that shift. You can just make that shift. No one will probably know it if you don't call attention to it, by the way. No one will probably know it. But just having in mind who am I trying to reach will change the way you teach on Sunday morning. And that will be a simple way to start to get results that you're not experiencing today. The other, going back to just simple stuff around guest services too, like actually building a team that is expecting guests to show up on Sunday morning. Making sure that team also represents the people that you're trying to reach as well. So making sure there's some faces that actually line up with the person that we're trying to connect with in our community. And, I've seen some data through the years where it's surprising how people actually make decisions about church and whether or not they're going to come back before they even step foot into the sanctuary, into the auditorium. And so, in fact, some of the last data we looked at the Unstuck Group, it was rather surprising how all the factors that we look at, message, worship experience, kids ministry, guest services, facilities, and on, all of those factors to some extent came into play when new people showed up and bringing new people back to the church. But you know what? The two highest factors were actually guest services. So was the church just providing a welcoming environment for new people, and the children's ministry environments. There was more correlation between new guests coming back around those two factors than even the worship music or the message itself. Now, again, I don't want pastors to hear my message is not important. No, it's still important. Yeah. It's very important. But for churches that are trying to engage new people, anything that you can do to improve that welcoming environment for new people, it's going to pay huge dividends. And then I hope you don't miss it. What you're doing for kids is also critical. Yes. And too many times I've walked into churches and you can kind of tell the adults, the older people, they get the first dibs on the nicest spaces, the best equipment, the best technology, the best worship, the best teaching, and the kids are just getting scraps. And the data would suggest that no, we actually may want to consider almost reversing our investment so that we're prioritizing what we're doing for the kids that are engaging, especially those new families that are showing up, because that may actually be more important to get some of those young families to come back to our church in the long run.
If I will say plug in here too. Keep your question, Kelly. But we have on staff Mary Ann Sibley, who actually that's what she does is guest volunteer and guest services. And she goes out and coaches churches. She will do it online. So if you're listening right now and going, okay, I got really convicted by what Tony said, what do I do? Just reach out to us and we'll connect you with Mary Ann. So go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, no, I was just going to give a personal example. I mean, I'm kind of a case in point about those two things. I've told this story a million times, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But when my husband and I were looking for a church, we tried really hard for a while and just couldn't find a place that fit because nobody really spoke to us and we just felt like outsiders. So there's that. Yeah. But also about the kids thing.
And I've had that experience too. I won't name names. I never name names when it's a church that maybe doesn't have that experience I was expecting. But this is a rather large church, and I was on site for multiple services that Sunday. And before and after every service, I went into the lobby, I grabbed a cup of coffee, and I just stood in the middle of the lobby.
Dale, you've
and
done that before,
no
right?
no one
spoke.
engaged with me.
Every church we go to is the friendliest church in America till Tony or me show up. And then and they won't talk to anybody.
Well, the only guy at that one of these specific churches, the only guy that ever talked to us, and he did speak to us every week, he never got my name right. He would even ask me, and I would correct him every week, and he would still get it wrong. So there's that. But going to the kids thing,
they did have good coffee, though, by the way. So just I'd put that in
which
there.
is the main deciding factor on choosing a church, right? But the kids thing, for me, I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, so we're kind of, really into the children's ministry part of our journey at church. But it's really important for me to feel like my kids are safe also where they're being left. Because, as a mom, especially these days, like the worst kind of thoughts can go through your head sometimes, especially when you're leaving your kids with people that you don't really know very well. So feeling safe and also welcomed is really important to me.
On that note, let me share this story. I was visiting a church once, and we had one of our younger kids at the time, checked her into children's ministry area. After the service, I'm standing in this line of parents to pick her up after the service.
Oh gosh.
And this person's coming down the line with a sign-up sheet asking every parent in the line to volunteer to serve next Sunday. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they have no idea who I am and what I've done in my past. And yet they are trusting me with other people's kids. And I can assure you, we never went back to that church after that, because it was a safety thing. If that's how they're getting people to volunteer, in air quotes, to serve in their kids ministry area, and they're not doing background checks, and they're not training me to actually serve in that space, I don't want my kid in that children's ministry area, and I'm not going to go back to that church because of that, because I want kids environment. Yeah.
I just think that the naivety still exists, especially in the small and mid-sized church, to not understand. I mean, we're not going to go down this road, but there's just lots of war stories. We have dear friends of churches that, even local churches, that
that's right,
where the wrong people took advantage of that kind of atmosphere and turned out really bad. Tony, we could talk to you for 16 hours. I mean, there's just so much.
Tony, you got to come back. We got a lot more to talk about.
Well, and I tend to be passionate about this. And you mentioned that earlier, Dale, and I've shared this, I think, even on your podcast in the past. I am passionate about this, and it's not because I necessarily want to serve more churches, though I do want to serve more churches. And it's not that I necessarily want to make a platform for myself. I certainly don't want to do that. And Dale, you know that very well. It's just not who I am.
Yeah.
But God's completely changed my life. I mean, he's completely transformed my life. And I was old enough to remember what my life was like before my relationship with Jesus. And just seeing what he's done in my life through the years, not only for me and my soul, but also how that then has been reflected in my marriage relationship, in my parenting, in the mission that I'm on now. I mean, it's just been transformative. And I just think, my goodness, I feel like the time is now. There's a receptivity to spiritual answers in the season like I think we've never seen before. And my goodness, it's just like, because of that, I want to rally every pastor. Now's not the time to consider stepping away from ministry. Now's the time to step in, because the opportunity is greater than it's ever been before. So that's why I'm passionate, and I'm sorry we've probably gone long because of that.
No. In fact, I want to give you one more shot at just to address this. So we have hundreds of small and mid-sized church leaders who listen every week, if you were talking to them personally today, and we just kind of wrapped up that conversation, what's one word of hope or advice or encouragement you'd give them if you could just share with them today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I look back at my personal spiritual journey, Dale, and there was a church that was highly influential at that pivotal season of my life. And it was a combination of the senior pastor, the youth pastor, and a lot of the lay leaders, the men in the church that stepped in that moment when I was seeking answers, and I was kind of at that crisis moment in my life, and they stepped in and invested in me in that season and began to help me take steps towards Jesus. It wasn't a mega church. I would not even say it was a mid-sized church. It was a small church in our small hometown. And I mean, it's just, I look at how God used that church, used those pastors, used those lay leaders to completely change my life. And I just think now is the time for us to go back to the call that God placed in our lives. Now is the time to lean in to the mission that he's given us. As we can't shirk back. We can't step away. God needs us now, especially for the pastors of the small churches that are listening.
Man,
that's so great.
I just appreciate you so much. What the impact you've had in my life. As I mentioned earlier, the impact you've had in my daughter's life, like I told you before, I think it's like, you and then me right below there somewhere. But anyway, just what you guys are doing. Thank you for the impact you're having. And I do want to say this, Pastor, if you're listening right now and you're like, I need help, I'm not doing well right now, I want to do what these guys have talked about, please reach out to us. We also have a strategic partner that can help you as well if you need counseling or help, or just we know we have to have healthy pastors if we're going to have healthy churches, and if you're not healthy, then we have the Full Strength Network that one of our strategic partners. We will help you find help, but because these are great days. This is not a time to shrink back. This is a time to press in. Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been awesome.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.